And Julie, we have really seen the government and also health authorities justifying its decision to shut down the construction industry for 2 weeks. There's been a lot of debate as to whether or not that was the right call. The federal government suggesting that that was perhaps overkill, but again hearing from health authorities today pointing out that the construction sector has been suffering from an increased rate of COVID cases. Hundreds of cases have been linked to construction sites and to construction workers, and they're certainly not backing away from that call on the mandatory vaccinations or that decision to pause construction full stop for the next 2 weeks.
That's exactly right, Ash. We heard from Victoria's Premier Daniel Andrews this morning after he was quite noticeably absent from the public eye yesterday. He didn't make any comments yesterday, but he did come out this morning in a united front with Victoria Police, and he said that they're very much standing by that decision to shut down the construction industry. He said there are more active cases tied to the construction industry than there are tied to aged care in Victoria, and more people tied to the industry than there are people in hospital with COVID-19. So there is still a real concern from the government, from our health authorities, that the COVID cases tied to the industry are continuing to climb. And not just construction workers who are here in Melbourne, people that live and work across regional Victoria and the city as well. And that was one of the measures that they introduced, the fact that they don't want any movement between the city and the regions. It doesn't look like the government's going to move off this decision anytime soon. In fact, they are even now going those steps further. They've just announced mandatory vaccinations for another industry altogether, for the education sector. We know that all staff are going to need to have their jab by a certain time in October, by the 18th of October, and fully vaccinated by the 29th of October. So this trend of mandating the COVID vaccination for industries is really going to continue.
The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is overseas at the moment, as we've been reporting today. He's in Washington, DC, but the Prime Minister was asked for his take on the scenes we've seen in Melbourne over the last couple of days. This is what Scott Morrison had to say.
None of us are above the law, and it's important that at a time like this, I know it is difficult when there are lockdown restrictions that have been put in place. These are measures that we've seen in other states when it comes to the construction sector and the outbreak. Similar arrangements were put in place in New South Wales, and I think it's just very important that we exercise that patience and we get through what is a very difficult time. The COVID disaster assistance payment, which has been made available right across Victoria, right across New South Wales, the ACT, for those who have a loss of income, then that is there to support them at this time, as it has been in other states and territories. So, look, I think it's important. I can understand that people would be concerned about the shutdown of the construction industry. These are important jobs and they will return. We will get through this, but the protest activity and what we've seen there, I think, is highly distressing, and that is not an appropriate response to trying to deal with an outbreak of this nature.
And Julia, all of this obviously coming as the COVID crisis continues, not to mention the earthquake this morning. It's all happening there in Melbourne today. We have seen Victoria today record 628 new cases. The majority of those new cases, Julia, are from Melbourne's northern suburbs, some 57% of cases stemming from there. Sadly, we learnt that 3 people have also died. In other big COVID news out of Melbourne today, Ballarat is ending its lockdown at midnight tonight. That'll bring it into line with the rest of regional Victoria. So good news today for residents of Ballarat. But health authorities also concerned that the sorts of protests we're seeing there in the CBD could be a super spreader event. We have seen concerns about a lack of mask wearing. Clearly, social distancing hasn't been a high priority either.
This is a continued concern, Ash. Melbourne isn't, I guess, new to protests and anti-lockdown protests. They've really been ramping up over the last few weeks, and especially since Victoria's government unveiled their long-awaited roadmap out of lockdown, which didn't provide a lot of hope to a lot of industries, to a lot of people. Melbourne is on track to become the most locked down city, the city that's been locked down for the longest, overtaking Buenos Aires. We will have spent 267 days in lockdown by the time it finishes in 5 weeks' time. So really, there is still the potential for these protests to continue on, and this is as our COVID cases continue to climb. There's concern, of course, from health officials that we are on the same trajectory as New South Wales when it comes to COVID cases. A significant concentration continues to be in the north of Melbourne. I'm just keeping an eye on my surroundings at the moment. Police seem to be walking off and grabbing protesters individually, but that's exactly right, as you say, Ash. The COVID cases continuing to climb here in Melbourne. The protests are going to continue. We'll have to wait and see as well what the impact of the decision to mandate vaccinations on the education sector will have. Certainly, there's been a lot of unrest from the construction industry, so we'll wait and see how that's received by education. My colleague, though, Melissa Crestidi, she was sitting in on the government's press conference a short time ago, and she also asked our health officials whether or not vaccinations are going to be mandated for the public service, which I also thought was quite an interesting question. No indication of whether or not it would be.
Julia, appreciate the update. Thank you for that.